Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is simply called Discerning What is True. I'm going to be reading from Chapter 8 of The Invisible Rainbow by author Firstenberg today on the last day of August 2024. It's August 31st. And let's see what we got here. Let's get to this, give you the title of the book. The title of the chapter. It's called The Mystery on the Isle of Wight, W-I-G-H-T. And let me set some few things here real quick before we start reading. So I continue the reading of this particular book, which is an eye-opening book that we all need to recognize as simply something phenomenal, something in the past has changed. Probably the change in the frequency on this planet. And very few people know that. So this is chapter 8. In 1904, the bees began to die. From this quiet island, 23 miles long and 13 miles wide, lying off England's southern coast, one looks across the English Channel towards the distant shores of France. In the preceding decade, two men, one on each side of the channel, one a physician and another one a physicist, one a physician and physicist, I should say, the other a inventor and entrepreneur, had occupied their minds with a newly discovered form of electricity. The work of each man had very different implications for the future of our world. At the westernmost end of the Isle of Wight, near offshore chalk formations called the Needles, in 1897, a handsome young man named Marconian erected his own needle, end quote, a tower as tall as a 12-story building. It supported the antenna for what became the world's first permanent radio station. Marconian was liberating electricity, vibrating at close to 1 million cycles per second from its confining wires, and was broadcasting it freely through the air itself. He did not stop to ask if this was safe. What this is about is radio. This is the beginning of radio here. Okay. A few years earlier, in 1890, a well-known physician named director of the Laboratory of Biological Physics at the College of France in Paris had already began investigations bearing on the important question Marconian was not asking: how does electricity of high frequencies affect living organisms? A distinguished presence in physics as well as medicine, Jacques Arsenault is remembered today for his many contributions in both fields. He devised what we call ultra-sensitive meters to measure magnetic fields and equipment to measure heat production and respiration in animals, made improvements to the microphone and the telephone, and created a new medical specialty called Darsonvalization. That's Darsonvalization, which is still practiced today in the nations of the former Soviet bloc. In the West, it had evolved into diathermy, which is the therapeutical use of radio waves to produce heat within the body. But Darsonvalization is the use of radio waves medically at low power without generating heat to produce the kinds of effects that Arsenault discovered in the early 1890s. He had first observed that electrical therapy as then practiced was not producing uniform results, and he wondered if this was because of lack of precision in the form of electricity being applied. He therefore designed an induction machine capable of putting out perfectly smooth sine waves. So what is a sine wave? Sine waves just like this, folks. This goes like almost just like the waves at the ocean, which are very beneficial to mankind. And if you know anything about me, as I've been sharing, I don't know, some people may know that in the Facebook deal, sine waves are used for healing. what we call square notches like this. It comes like, goes up, drops, goes up, not up, it goes straight, it drops, is for killing. This was developed later on by a gentleman named Raymond Rife. That is the part of the square notches. When he tested this current on human subjects, he found, as he had predicted, that all therapeutic doses it caused no pain, yet had potent physiological effects. Quote, we have seen that with very steady sine waves, nerve and muscles are not stimulated, he wrote. Quote, the passage of the current, nevertheless, is responsible for profound modifications of metabolism, as shown by the consumption of a greater amount of oxygen and production of considerably more carbon dioxide. If the shape of the wave is changed, each electrical wave will produce a muscular contraction. Dr. Arsenault had already discovered the reason 125 years ago why today digital technologies whose waves have nothing but jerks and teeth are causing so much illness. You hear that? Now, some of us, on my Facebook page, my name is simply Brand Hunt, Facebook, is I'm talking about some information that I'm talking about a company called Spooky 2. A product is a lot of the technologies comes from two major persons, Tesla and Raymond Rife. And Raymond Rife proved that basically he could kill certain pathogens within the body without also injuring anything part of you. He came to what we call a particular frequency to cause what we call squares. It's like I said, square down, over, down, and each time, and the more rapidly it begins to kill what's within you that is causing harm to you. We already have the technology, folks. It's out there. Unfortunately, modern medicine is way behind, still in the Stone Age, and pretending that somehow the drugs actually solve the problem, when all it does is simply cover up everything that is going on within your body. It doesn't heal. It masks, you see. Doesn't mean they don't have anything good in medicine. Yes, they do. The problem is simply it has side effects that are actually detrimental, you see. The Arsenault next experimental with alternating currents of high frequency using a modification of the wireless apparatus devised a few years earlier by Heinrich Hertz. Now, these two major names, I'm just going to tell you, Hertz is also involved with radio, as you can see, and we know simply is that the gentleman Marconian, Italian, was also involved in radio, okay? He exposed humans and animals to currents of 500,000 to 1 million cycles per second, applied either by direct contact or indirectly by induction from a distance. They were close to the frequency Marconian was soon going to broadcast from the Isle of Wight. In no case did the subject body temperatures increase, but in every case his subject blood pressure fell significantly without, in the case of a human subject at least, any conscious sensation. Arsenault measured the same changes in oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production as with low-frequency currents. These facts prove, he wrote, quote, that the currents of high frequency penetrate deeply into the organism, end quote. These early results should have made anyone experimenting with radio waves think twice before exposing the whole world to them indiscriminately. Should have at least made them cautiously. So Marconian, however, was unfamiliar with the Arsenault work. Largely self-educated, the inventor had no inklings of radio potential dangers and no fear of it. Therefore, when he powered up his new transmitter on the island, he had no suspicion that he might be doing himself or anyone else any harm. If radio waves are dangerous, Marconian, of all people in the world, should have suffered from them. Let us see if he did. As early as 1896, after a year and a half of experimenting with radio equipment in his father's attic, The previously healthy 22-year-old youth began running high temperatures, which attributed to his stress. These fevers were to recur for the rest of his life. By 1900, so we're looking at a few years later, 4 years later, his doctors were speculating that perhaps he had unknowingly had rheumatic fever as a child. By 1904, his bouts of chills and fever had become so severe that he was thought they were recurrences of malaria. At that time, he was occupied with building a permanent super high power radio link across the Atlantic Ocean between Cornwall, England, and Cape Breton Island, that is in Nova Scotia. Because he thought that longer distance required longer waves, he suspended tremendous wire net aerials, occupying acres of land on multiple towers, hundreds of feet tall, on both sides of the ocean, I should say, not island, ocean. On March 16, 1905, Marconi married Beatrice O'Brien. In May, after their honeymoon, he took her to live in the station house at Port Morion on Cape Breton. So we went all the way to Nova Scotia, surrounded by 28 huge radio towers in 3 concentric circles. Looming over the house, 200 antenna wires stretched out from a center pole like the spokes of a great umbrella, more than 1 mile in circumference. As soon as Beatrice settled in, her ears began to ring. And then to show a picture here from a history of the Marconi Company from W.J. Baker, St. Martin's Press in 1971. After 3 months there, she was ill with severe jaundice. When Marconi took her back to England, it was to live underneath the other monster aerial at Poda Bay in Cornwall. She was pregnant all this time, and although she moved to London before giving birth, her child has spent most of its 9 months of fetal life bombarded with powerful radio waves and lived only a few weeks, dying of quote-unquote unknown causes. At about the same time, Marconi himself collapsed completely, spending much of February through May of 1906 feverishly and delirious. Between 1918 and 1921, while engaged in designing shortwave equipment, Marconi suffered from bouts of suicidal depression. In 27, during the honeymoon he took with his second wife, Maria Christina, he collapsed with chest pains and was diagnosed with a severe heart condition. Between 1934 and 1937, while helping to develop microwave technology, he suffered as many as 9 heart attacks, the final one fatal at the age of 63. Now, there's a battle that took place. I know this because simply as I spent time in shortwave clubs and involved in shortwave radio for myself. I'm not a ham operator. I'm just simply like to listen to foreign stations in the past. And no one ever said anything about this. No one. And so there was a rivalry between Tesla and Marconi for the patent for shortwave radio, or transmitter, I should say. And eventually it was given to Marconi. I don't know if I agree with that or not, So his first wife, let's see, let's go back. I thought his first wife also passed away. I'm trying to see. I know the child died. Apparently, I don't see it here. She was ill. It doesn't say anything, but I thought she passed away. I don't know, because obviously she must have passed away because he married his second wife. And he collapsed with chest pains. Anyway, bystanders sometimes tried to warn him. Even at his first public demonstrations on Salisbury Plain in 1896, there were spectators who later sent him letters describing various nerve sensations they had experienced. His daughter, Dejanal, I guess it's Dejanal, reading them much later while doing research for the biography of her father, was particularly taken by one letter from a woman who, quote, who wrote that his ways made her feel tickled, end quote. Dejanal, his daughter, wrote that her father received letters of this sort frequently. When in 1899 he built the first French station in the coastal town of Winmerz, one man who lived close by, quote, burst in with a revolver, end quote, claiming that the waves were causing him sharp internal pains. Marconian dismissed all such report as fantasy. This is what happens when you got people who won't listen, who are just determined to do whatever they're going to do, and not realize that what they're doing is causing harm. It's probably the same thing that's happening in our world today, if you know what I mean. So, in what may have been a even more ominous warning, Queen Victoria of England, in residence at Osborne House, her estate at the north end of Isle of Wight, suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and died on the evening of January 22nd, 1901. Just as Marconian was firing up a new, more powerful transmitter 12 miles away. He was hoping to communicate with Palahu the next day, 300 kilometers distance, twice as far as any previous recorded radio broadcast. And he did. And on January 23rd, he sent a telegram to his cousin Henry Jameson Davison saying, quote, completely successful. Keep information private. Signed, William. And then there were the bees. In 1901, there were already two Marconian stations on the Isle of Wight. Marconian's original station, which had been moved to Niton, Niton, at the south end of the island, next to St. Catherine's Lighthouse, and the Culver Signal Station, run by the Coast Guard at the east end on Culver Down. By 1904, two more had been added. I'm trying to figure out where he got all this money to do this. That's another speculation on my part here. I don't know if they answered that and just continued on. According to, people have to have money to do this. Someone has to be someone behind giving him some kind of support. You just don't run out and do these things. You may have this, but who gives you money to do this? Everything costs, experiments cost money, period. According to an article published in that year by Eugene P. Lau in World's Work magazine, 4 Marconian stations were now operating on the small island, communicating with a steadily growing number of naval and commercial ships of many nations, steaming through the channel. They were equipped with similar apparatus. It was the greatest concentration of radio signals in the world at that time. In 1906, the Lloyd Signal Station, half a mile east of St. Catherine's Lighthouse, also acquired wireless equipment. At this point, the bee situation became so severe that the Board of Agriculture and Fishery called in biologist Augustus Emmons of Christ's College, Cambridge, to investigate. 90% of the honeybees had disappeared from the entire island for no apparent reason. All the hives all had plenty of honey, but the bees could not even fly. Quote, they are often to be seen crawling up grass stems or up the supports of the hive, where they remain until they fall back to the earth from sheer weakness and soon afterwards die, he wrote. Swarms of healthy bees were imported from the mainland, but it was of no use. Within a week, the fresh bees were dying off by the thousands. In coming years, quote, Isle of Wight disease, end quote, spread like a plague throughout Great Britain and into the rest of the world. Severe losses of bees being reported in parts of Australia, Canada, United States, and South Africa. Disease was also reported in Italy, Brazil, France, Switzerland, and Germany, although for years another parasitic mite was blamed. British bee pathologist Leslie Bailey disproved these theories in 1950 and came to regard the disease itself as a sort of a myth. Obviously, the bees had died, he said, but not from anything contagious. He probably was looking in the medical field. He's probably not looking in the frequency field. Let's see. He would probably not even know that. Over time, Isle of Wight disease took fewer and fewer bees' lives as the insects seemed to adapt to whatever had changed in their environment. Places that had been attacked first recovered first. Then in 1917, just as the bees on the Isle of Wight itself appeared to be regaining their former vitality, an event occurred that changed the electrical environment of the rest of the world. Millions of dollars of United States government money was suddenly mobilized in a crash program to equip the Army, Navy, and Air Force with the most modern communication capability possible. The entry of the United States into the Great War, April 6, 1917, simulated an expansion of radio broadcast that was as sudden and rapid as the 1889 expansion of electricity. Again, it was the bees that gave the first warning. It's just like the proverbial, trying to think of the type of bird that is in the mines. It's a warning. Hello, hello, I'm here. I'm dead now, so to speak. That's what's occurring. Even now, we know sometimes there have been bees that have died off in the last few years here in the country, here in America, and also elsewhere. Quote, Mr. Charles Schleich of Morganville, Monmouth County, a beekeeper with considerable experience operating about 300 colonies, reported a great loss of bees from the hives in one of his yards located near Rockell. End quote. Read one report published in August 1918. Quote, thousands of dead were lying and thousands of dying bees were crawling about in the vicinity of the hive, collecting in groups on bits of water, on stones, and in depressions in the earth. The affected bees appeared to be practically all young adult workers about the age when they would normally do the first field work, but all ages of older bees were found. No abnormal conditions within the hive was noticed at this time. So in other words, their immune system, if we say immune system, I'm not thinking here, they were not yet ready. Okay. This outbreak was confined to Morganville, Freehold, Millhurst, and nearby areas of New Jersey. Just a few miles seaward from one of the most powerful radio stations on the planet, the one in New Brunswick that had just been taken over by the government for service in the war. A 50,000-watt Anderson alternator had been installed in February of that year to supplement a less efficient 350,000-watt spark apparatus. Both provided power to a mile-long aerial consisting of 32 parallel wires supported by 12 steel towers 400 feet long, broadcasting military communications across the ocean to the command in Europe. Radio came of age during the First World War. For long-distance communication, there were no satellites and no shortwave equipment at this time. So this is usually, some of it was what they call long wave, which long wave simply is the low wave of the band, very low. It's below the AM band. So you have like, I think the lowest here in America is like 540 kilohertz. From there on, basically I think it's 530. Anyway, on down to the spectrum, that is long wave. So radio came of age during the First World War. For long distance communication, there was no, okay, I've said that, sorry. Transistors were decades into the future. It was the era of immense radio waves, inefficient areas the size of small mountains, and spark gap transmitters that scatter radiation like buckshot all over the radio spectrum to interfere with everyone else's signals. Oceans were crossed by brute force 300,000 watts of electricity being supplied to those mountains to achieve a radio power of perhaps only 30,000. So it's very inefficient. The rest was wasted as heat. Morse code could be sent, but not voice. Reception was sporadic and unreliable. Few of the great powers had had a chance to establish overseas communication with their colonies before World War intervened in 1914. The United Kingdom had 2 ultra-powerful stations at home, but no radio links for the colony. The first such link was still under construction near Cairo. France had 1 powerful station at Effington Tower and another at Lyon, but no links with any of the overseas colonies. Belgium had a powerful station in Congo State, but blew up its home station at Brussels after war broke out. Italy had 1 powerful station in Eritrea, and Portugal had 1 in Mozambique and 1 in Angola. So they're talking about their colonies here. Now, remember, this is in the late 1800s. The Europe took a decision to basically rob the people in Africa and establish their own quote unquote colonies to basically rob from them. Italy had one powerful station to trade out. Okay, so Norway had one ultra potent transmitter, Japan one, and Russia one. Only Germany had made much progress in building an imperial chain, but within months after the declaration of war, all of its overseas stations, that in Togo, Dar es Salaam, Yap, Samoa, Nauru, New Pomerania, Cameroon, Kia, Shul, and Germany, East Africa were destroyed. So they destroyed them all because of fear, I guess fear, because the enemy would take them over. Radio in short was in its faltering infancy, still crawling as it attempts to walk hindered by the onset of the European War during 1915 and 1916. The United Kingdom made progress in installing 13 long-range stations in various parts of the world in order to keep in contact with its Navy. So they had to have, in order to communicate with the Navy, they had to have stations all across the world. The stations were limited, you see. They can only go so many miles. And they had to have contact in order of what the leaders were trying to tell them, what they're supposed to be doing, the admirals of the ships, whatever, so that they have a bearing on what's going on with the war situation. When the United States entered the war in 1917, it changed the terrain in a hurry. The United States Navy already had one giant transmitter at Arlington, Virginia, and a second at Darien, D-A-R-I-E-N, in the Canal Zone. A third in San Diego began broadcasting in May of 1917. A fourth was at Pearl Harbor on October 1st of that year, and a fifth at Cavite, the Philippines, on December 19th. The Navy also took over and upgraded private and foreign-owned stations at Linz, Oregon, South San Francisco, California, Bolinas, California, Kahutka, Hawaii, Hikahia Point, Hawaii, Saleville, Long Island, Tuckerton, New Jersey, and New Brunswick, New Jersey. By late 1917, 13 American stations were sending messages across two oceans. So they were doing it in the Atlantic and Pacific. 50 more medium and high-power radio stations ringed the United States in possession for communication with ships. To equip its ships, and the Navy manufactured and developed over 10,000 low, medium, and high-power transmitters. By early 1918, the Navy was graduating over 400 students per week from its radio operating courses. 400 students per week? Wow, that's 1,200 a month. In the short course, 4 times 4, no, it'd be actually 1,600. In the short course of a year between April 6th and early 19th, the Navy built and was operating the world's largest radio network. American transmitters were far more efficient than most of those built previously. When a 30 kilowatt Paulson arc was installed at Arlington in 1913, it was found to be so much superior to the 100 kilowatt spark apparatus there that the Navy adopted the arc as its preferred equipment and ordered sets with higher and higher ratings. A 100 kilowatt arc was installed at Darien, a 200 kilowatt arc in San Diego, a 350 kilowatt. Let's see, 350 kilowatt. That means 350,000 watts. Okay. That's huge. At Pearl Harbor and Cavite in the Philippines. In 1917, 30 kilowatt arcs were being installed on Navy ships. 30,000 kilowatts. Even that's a lot on a ship. Outclassing the transmitters on most ships of other nations. Still, the arc was basically only a spark gap with electricity flowing across it continuously instead of it in bursts. It still sprayed the airways with unwanted harmonics, transmuted voices poorly, and was not reliable enough for continuous day and night communication. So the Navy tried out its first high-speed alternator, the one it inherited at New Brunswick. Alternators did not have spark gaps at all. Like fine musical instruments, they produced purely continuous waves that could be sharply tuned and modulated for crystal clear voice or telegraphic communication. So what is happening now, they're using what we call a wave, a continuous wave, instead of this is why, when it's continuous running and then using spark gaps, and actually like you're communicating like on a telegraph type of thing. They're moving away from that. Ernest Andresen, who designed them, also designed antenna to go with them that increased radiation efficiency sevenfold. When tested against the 350 kilowatt time spark at the same station, the 50 kilowatt alternator proved to have a bigger range. So in February of 1918, the Navy began to rely on the alternator to handle continuous communication with Italy and France. Wow, isn't it amazing? It's over 100 years ago. So they're able now to have complete, what I call not sporadic communications, but continuous. In July of 1918, another 200 kilowatt arc was added to the system the Navy had taken over at Salebill. In September of 1918, a 500 kilowatt, which is 500,000, arc went on the air at a new naval station at Annapolis, Maryland. Meanwhile, the Navy had ordered a second, more powerful alternator for New Brunswick of 200 kilowatt capacity. Installed in June, it too went on the air full time in September. New Brunswick immediately became the most powerful station in the world, outclassing Germany's flagship stations at Norriton, and was the first that transmitted both voice and telegraphic messages across the Atlantic Ocean clearly, continuously, and reliable. Its signal was heard over a large part of the earth because there was no other communications out there, folks. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, hello, here's what I'm trying to say. There is no competition. The waves are silent, so to speak. There's no interference. But then the disease that was called Spanish influenza, the flu, was born during these months. It did not originate in Spain. It did, however, kill tens of millions all over the world, and it became suddenly more fatal in September of 1918. By some estimates, the pandemic struck more than 500 million people, or a third of the world's population. Even the Black Death of the 14th century did not kill so many in so short a period of time. No wonder everyone is terrified of its return. A few years ago, researchers dug up 4 bodies in Alaska that had lain frozen in the permafrost since 1918, and were able to identify RNA from an influenza virus in the lung tissue of one of them. This was the monster germ that was supposed to have failed so many in the prime of their lives, the microbe that so resemble a virus of pigs, against whose return we are to exercise eternal vigilance, lest it decimate the world again. But there is no evidence that the disease of 1918 was contagious. The Spanish influenza, that is the flu, apparently originated in the United States in early 1918, seemed to spread around the world on Navy ships, and first appeared on board those ships and seaports and naval stations. The largest early outbreak, laying low about 400 people, occurred in February in a naval radio station in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is all key, folks. This is because that's what's happening now. Okay, this is what's happening with people now. Okay, this is why people are sick today. Let's just call it like it is. In March, the flu spread to Army camps where the Signal Corps were being trained in the use of the wireless. Interesting. 1,127 men contracted the flu in Camp Funston, Funston, in Kansas, and 2,900 men in Oglethorpe camps in Georgia. In late March and April, the disease spread to the civilian population around the world. It was mild at first. The epidemic exploded with death in September everywhere in the world at once. Man's playing with something he doesn't have any business doing with, folks, here already. Waves of mortality travel with astonishing speed over the global ocean of humanity again and again until their force was finally spent 3 years later. Its victims were often sick repeatedly for months at a time. One of the things that puzzled doctors the most was all of the bleeding. 10 to 15% of the flu patients seen in private practices, and up to 40% of the flu patients in the Navy suffered from nosebleeds. Doctors sometimes describing the blood as, quote, gushing from the nostrils. Others bled from their gums, ears, skin, stomach, intestinals, uterus, or kidneys, the most common and rapid route to death between hemorrhaging in the lungs. Flu victims drown in their own blood. Autopsies revealed that as many as 1/3 of fatal cases had also hemorrhaged into their brain. And occasionally a patient appeared to be recovering from respiratory symptoms only to die of a brain hemorrhage. The quote, the irregularity with which these various hemorrhages appeared suggests the possibility of there being a change in the blood itself, end quote, wrote Dr. Arthur Erskine and B.L. Knight of Cedar Rapids, Iowa in late 1918. So they tested the blood from a large number of patients with the flu and pneumonia. Quote, in every case tested without a single exception, quote, they wrote, quote, the coagulability of the blood was lessened. The increase in time required for coagulation varying from 2.5 to 8 minutes more than normal. Blood was tested as early as the second day of infection and as late as the 20th day of convalescence from pneumonia with the same results. Several local physicians also tested blood from their patients, and while our records are at this time necessarily incomplete, we have yet to receive a report of a case in which the time of coagulation was not prolonged, end quote. This is consistent not with any respiratory virus, but with what has been known about electricity ever since Gerhardt did the first experiment on human blood in 1779. It is consistent with what is known about the effects of radio waves on blood coagulation. Erskine and Knight saved their patients not by fighting infection, but by giving them large doses of calcium lactate. Large doses of calcium lactate to facilitate blood clotting. So in other words, the default is simply, it was not anything to do with what we call a flu, and many doctors would think that, but what these doctors did, these two guys in Iowa, discovered simply is we need to get this blood to not flow so quickly. Let's coagulate it. Let's, quote unquote, use calcium lactate to facilitate blood clotting. Another astonishing fact that makes no sense if this pandemic was infectious, but that makes good sense, it was caused by radio waves. And I'll say that again. It was caused by radio waves. Is that instead of striking down the old and the infirm like most diseases, this one was killing mostly healthy, vigorous young people between the ages of 18 and 40, just as the previous pandemic had done, with a little less virulence in 1889. Quote, this, as we saw in chapter 5, is the same as the predominant age range from neurasthenia, the chronic form of electrical illnesses. 2/3 of all flu deaths were in this age range. Elderly patients were rare. One doctor in Switzerland wrote that he knew of, quote, knew no one in case in an infinite and no severe cases in persons over 50, end quote. But that, quote, one robust person showed the first symptoms at 4 p.m. and died before 10 the next morning. They had no immunity. I'm looking at it, let's say, and speculating. They had no immunity. That's my speculation. I don't know. A reporter in Paris went so far as to say that, quote, only persons between 50 and 40 years of age are affected. It's almost as though it was geared to the people prime in their age. The prognosis was better if you were in poor physical condition, if you were undernourished, physically handicapped, anemic, or tuberculosis. You were much less likely to get the flu and much less likely to die from it if you did. This is such a common observation that Dr. D.B. Armstrong wrote a provocative article published in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal titled The Flu, Influential. Is it a hazard to be healthy? End quote. Doctors were seriously discussing whether they were actually giving their patients a death sentence by advising them to keep fit. The flu was reported to be even more fatal for pregnant women. A further peculiarity, that had doctors scratching their heads, was that in most cases, after the patient's temperature had returned to normal, their pulse rate fell below 60 and remained there for a number of days. In more serious cases, the pulse rate fell to between 36 and 48. Indication of a heart block. This too is puzzling for a respiratory virus, but will make sense when we learn about radio wave sickness. Patients also regularly lost some of their hair 2 to 3 months after recovering from the flu. According to Samuel Ayres, a dermatologist at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, this was an almost daily occurrence. Most of their patients being young women. This is not an expected after effect of respiratory viruses either, but hair loss has been widely reported from exposure to radio waves. And all these have footnotes here, folks. Yet another puzzling observation was that so few patients in 1918 had sore throats, runny noses, or other initiative, what we call respiratory symptoms. But the neurological symptoms, just as in the pandemic of 1889, were rampant even in mild cases. They ranged from insomnia, stupor, dull perception, unusual heightened perceptions, tingling, itching, and impairment of hearing to weakness or partial paralysis of the palatal, eyelids, eyes, and various other muscles. The famous Carl Menninger reported on 100 cases of psychosis triggered by the flu, including 35 of these being schizophrenic, that he saw during a 3-month period. Although the infection nature of this illness was widely assumed, masses and quarantines and isolation were all without effect. I'll say it again, make this very clear to you. This is also affected by a footnote. Although the infectious nature of this illness was widely assumed, masks, quarantines, and isolation were all without effect. It didn't work, period. Even in an isolated country like Iceland, the flu spread universally in spite of the quarantining of its victims. Disease seemed to spread impossibly fast. Quote, there is no reason to suppose that it traveled more rapidly than persons could travel, but it has appeared to do so, wrote Dr. George A. Soper, S-O-P-E-R, Major in the United States Army. But most revealing of all were the various heroic attempts to prove the infectious nature of the disease using volunteers. All these attempts made in November and December 1918 and February and March of 1919 failed. One medical team in Boston working for the United States Public Health Service tried to infect 100 healthy volunteers between the age of 18 and 25. Their effects were impressive and made entertaining reading. Quote, we collected the material and mucus secretions of the mouth and nose. I'm going to say this very clearly, folks. Hear it, right here. You better have ears to hear. We collected the material and mucus secretions of the mouth and nose and throat and broncho from cases of the disease and transferred this to our volunteers. Hello. We also obtained this material in the same way. The patient with fever in bed had a large, shallow, tray-like arrangement for him or her, and we washed out one nostril with some sterile salt solution using perhaps 5 cc's, which is allowed to run into the tray, and that nostril is blown vigorously into the tray. This is repeated with the other nostril. The patient then gargled with some of the solutions. Next, we obtained some bronchitis or bronchial mucus through coughing, and then we swabbed the mucus surface of each narrows and also the mucous surface of the throat. Each one of the volunteers received 6 cc's of the mixed stuff that I have described. They received it, and into each nostril, received it in their throat and on the eye. And when you think that the 6 cc is all we was used, we would understand that some of it was swallowed. None of them took sick. Repeat, none of them took sick. End quote. In a further experiment with new volunteers and donors, the salt solution was eliminated, and with cotton swabs, the material was transferred directly from nose to nose and from throat to throat, using donors in the first, second, or third day of disease. Quote, none of these volunteers who received the material, thus directly transferred cases, took sick in any way. All the volunteers received at least 2 and sometimes 3 shots as they expressed it, end quote. In a further experiment, 20 cc's of blood from each of the 5-6 donors was mixed and injected to each volunteer. Quote, none of them took sick in any way, end quote. So what is happening here? That kind of kills the idea you spread stuff to other people and you get it. Sorry, it doesn't work that way, folks. You've been lied to about all this shit. Quote, then we collected a lot of mucus material from the upper respiratory tract and filtered it through mandibular filters. This filtrate was injected into 10 volunteers, each one receiving 3.5 cc's subcutaneously, and none of these took sick in any way. End quote. Then a third attempt was made to transfer the disease, quote, in the natural way, end quote, using fresh volunteers and donors. The volunteer, quote, the volunteer was led up to the bedside of the patient. He was introduced. He sat down alongside the bed of the patient. They shook hands, and by instruction, he got as close as he could get, conveniently could, as they talked for 5 minutes. At the end of the 5 minutes, the patient breathed out as hard as he could, while the volunteer, muzzle to muzzle, in accordance with his instructions, about 2 inches between the two, received this expired breath, at the same time was breathing in as the patient breathed out. After they had done this for 5 times, the patients coughed directly into the face of the volunteer, face to face, 5 different times. Then he removed to the next patient whom we have selected and repeated this, and so on until this volunteer had had that sort of contact with 10 different cases of the flu in different stages of the disease, mostly fresh cases, none of them more than 3 days old. None of them still took sick in any way. End quote. Something's wrong with the medical system here, folks. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Quote, we entered the outbreak with a notion that we knew the cause of the disease and were quite sure we knew how it was transmitted from person to person, perhaps, end quote, concluded Dr. Milton Rosenau. Quote, if we have learned anything, it is that we are not quite sure of what we know about the disease, end quote. Early attempts to demonstrate contagions in horses had met with the same resounding failure. Healthy horses were kept in close contact with sick ones during all stages of disease. Nose bags were kept on horses that had nasal discharge at high temperatures. These nose bags were used to contain food for other horses, which, however, stubbornly remained healthy. As a result of these and other attempts, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Walken Pitchfork of the British Army Veterinary Corps wrote in July 1917 that he could find no evidence that the flu was ever spreading directly from one horse to another. Kind of kills Pasteur's perspective, doesn't it? The other 2 influential pandemics of the 20th century in 1957 and 1968 were also associated with milestones of electrical technology, pioneered once again by the United States. Radar, first used extensively during World War II, was deployed on a spectacular scale by the United States during the mid-1950s, as it sought to surround itself with a triple layer of protection that would detect any nuclear attack. The first and smallest barrier was the 39 stations of the Pine Tree Line, which kept vigil from coast to coast across southern Canada and from Nova Scotia northward to Baffin Island. This line, completed in 1954, was the roots, as it were, for a huge tree of surveillance that grew between 1956 and 58, whose branches spread across mid and high latitude Canada, sent shoots into Alaska, and drooped down over to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to guard the United States on east, west, and north. When it was complete, hundreds of radar domes resembling golf balls the size of buildings littered the Canadian landscape from ocean to ocean, from the American border to the Arctic. The Mid-Canada line extended 2,700 miles from Hopedale, Laborio, to Dawson Creek, British Columbia, consisted of 98 powerful Doppler radars, 30 miles apart and roughly 300 miles north of the Pine Tree Line. Construction of the first station began on October 1st, 56, and the complete system was dedicated on January 1st, 1958. Done within 2 years, less than 2 years. The 58 stations at what they call a distance early warning, called a dew line, kept their frozen watch roughly along the 69 parallel, 200 miles north of the Arctic Circle, in a chain extending from Baffin Island to the Northwestern Territories and across Alaska. Each main site, of which there were 33, had 2 pulse transmitters, one controlling a pencil beam for long-range precision tracking, the other a wider beam for general surveillance. Each beam had a peak power of 500 kilowatts. In other words, 500,000 watts. so that each site had a maximum peak capacity of 1 million watts. Are you kidding me? The frequency was between 1220 and 1350 millihertz. The other 25, what they call gap filler stations, had continuous wave Dopplers rated at 1 kilowatt and operated at 500 millihertz. Construction began in 1955 and a complete system was dedicated on July 31st, 1957. The dude line extended down to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and lines of naval ships, 4 in the Atlantic and 5 in the Pacific, supplemented by fleets of Lockheed aircraft that cruised in 12 to 14-hour shifts at 3,000 to 6,000 feet in altitude. The radar-bearing ships and planes of the Atlantic Barrier were based in Maryland and Newfoundland and patrolled the waters out to the Azores. Atlantic operations began testing on July 1st, 1956, and were fully deployed 1 year later. The Pacific Barrier, based in Hawaii and Midway, scanned the ocean off western North America and patrolled roughly from Midway to Kodiak Island, which is also in Alaska. Its first 2 ships were assigned to Pearl Harbor in 1956, and the Barrier became fully operational on July 1st, 1958. In addition, there were 3 Texas towers equipped with long range, radars were placed about 100 miles off the Atlantic coast and affixed to the ocean floor. The first was 110 miles east of Cape Cod, began operation in December 1955, while the third was 84 miles southeast of New York Harbor, was activated in early September 1957. Finally, every one of the 995 initial radar sites blanketing Canadian skies had to be able to send surveillance data from mostly very remote locations, and so high-power radio transmitters were added to each site, typically operating the microwave spectrum between 600 and 1,000 megahertz, with broadcast power of up to 40 kilowatts. So it's not a super powerful station, AM. This is only, it's not AM, it's FM. Millihertz is FM. And then it also powers up to 40 kilowatts. They used a technology called tropospherical scatter, end quote. Huge antenna, the shape of curved billboards, aim their signal above the distance horizon so as to bounce them off particles in the lower atmosphere 6 miles above the Earth, and thereby reach a receiver hundreds of miles away. Another complete network of such antennas called the White Alice communication system was installed throughout Alaska at the same time. The first ones were put into service on November 12, 1956, and the complete signal system was dedicated on 26 March 1958. The Asian influenza pandemic began about the end of February of 1957 and lasted for more than a year. The bulk of the mortality occurred in the fall and winter of 1957 and 58. A decade later, the United States launched the world's first constellation of military satellites into orbit at an altitude of about 18,000 nautical miles, right in the heart of the outer Van Allen radiation belt, called the Initiative Defense Communication Satellite Program, IDCSP. Its 28 satellites began operational after the last 8 were launched on June 13, 1968. Quote, the Hong Kong flu pandemic began in July 1968 and lasted until March of 1970. Although there has already been a few satellites in space, they had all been launched one at a time during the 1960s. At the beginning of 1968, there had been a total of only 13 operating satellites orbiting above the Earth. In one fell swoop, the IDCSP not only more than tripled the number, but placed them in the middle of the most vulnerable layer of the Earth's magnetic sphere. In each case, 1889, 1918, 1957, and 1968, the electrical envelope of the Earth, which will be described in the next chapter, into which we all are attached by individual strings, was suddenly and profoundly disturbed. Those for whom this attachment was strongest, whose roots were most vital, whose life rhythms were tuned most closely to the accustomed pulsation of our planet. In other words, vigorously healthy young adults and pregnant women. Those were the individuals who most suffered and died, like an orchestra whose conductor has suddenly gone mad. Their organs, their living instruments no longer knew how to play. So that's the end of chapter 8. So I just want to read this chapter today. Hope you enjoyed it. It is very thought. You need to think about these folks. You really do. I don't know why people don't seem to understand this is a critical book. I doubt, like I said, 5,000 books are ever published. I doubt that. But this work is enormously important for those to understand. That it seems as though man seems to be determined to actually destroy himself in some way on a large scale by his own foolishness. So this is going to be my conclusion today. Again, this is chapter 8, The Invisible Rainbow by author Firstenberg. Thank you for listening, and I wish you a good day. Take care.